Okay, showtime, folks. We should be live into the LinkedIn abyss. I can see it in my corner doing a quick countdown and a little red dot which says we are live. So please do not swear. We have the final webinar of the year. Run a number of these throughout this year, and this is the final one to round off all webinars for Christmas. So as of today, business is closed. But before we close for business, I'm really delighted to have a couple of people joining me to kind of, I suppose, bring some really interesting and value-adding perspectives to the topic that we've got today around human-centered feedback. I think we've all had feedback before, and where we consider it to be a gift. We wish it had come with a gift receipt so we can give it back. Today's webinar is about how we really think about the approach to giving feedback, how that aligns to the objectives and the key performance indicators and everything else that we've got that we run our businesses on, and how we can think about having a more positive approach to feedback and maybe take some different perspectives. And to really help me dig into that, I'm joined by two awesome people. I'm going to come to you first, Stuart, and I'm going to ask you to tell the viewers or the LinkedIn audience that might be listening a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gary. I wasn't even considering swearing, funnily enough, but you brought it up. So now I'm kind of like best behavior. But yeah, never mind. So nice to see you. Thank you very much for having me on. My name's Stuart Kirby. I run a company called Sparks over in Saudi Arabia. We're a training, development, education company. We do some production stuff as well. But a lot of what my day-to-day role involves working with people that want to move from A to B, and sometimes right through from A to Z, and helping our team here putting a process and a structure in place to help the people that we work with, our students. Some of those will be brand new, fresh people that want to become software engineers. Some of them will be really experienced engineers that are just trying to make the next step, and what our processes are going to be to help everyone succeed in the space. So super excited, and thank you for having me.
Brilliant. And we've got some tough questions to put you under the spotlight as well. So I'm sure you're going to add tons of value. So thank you very
I've
much for
met Kate
joining us.
before, honestly. So yeah, I know.
Brilliant. Kate, tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Gary. Great to see you again, Stuart. So I'm Kayla Clails, and I'm one of the co-founders, including Gary, of High Performing Culture, which is something that I'm going to be threading into today's conversation. But I also own my own small business, which is a coaching and training company. I work with small to medium enterprises, although I've worked with some big brands as well. And I thought about this morning. You know, that great question when somebody says, what do you do? What's your why? So I help people unpack the habits that hold them back and home into the strengths that they have to create high performing cultures. And also what I'm doing at the moment, I would say, is challenging the norms, the traditions of training from the way that we think about how people learn. So really, really pleased to be part of today's conversation, and thanks for inviting me, Gary.
Brilliant. So we should be live on LinkedIn, but just to test the theory, to see if we are live. If you are tuning in and you are watching, feel free to drop a little comment into the LinkedIn live event. Just tell us a little bit about who you are, maybe where you're calling from or dialing in from or watching from, just so we can see how far we're reaching here. And it also just gives me a little bit of comfort that we're not talking to ourselves. But let's kick off the session today. And if anybody does have any questions throughout, please feel free to drop them in the comments section. If it's a question for the panel, or if there's just a topic that really resonates with you, because I can show them on screen a little bit like this, and I can put it to the panelists and ask them your question from the audience, because it's an interactive session, and this is why we choose LinkedIn Live as a medium, because it allows us to kind of have that back and forth and tackle topics and questions that matter to you most. But I want to start off a little bit just around, I suppose, thinking about the topic of feedback, and I'm going to start with you on this, Kay. And I think sometimes feedback gets a bit of a bad rep, doesn't it? In that we conjure that word feedback, and instinctively we go to the negative. And we think, oh, actually, what have I done wrong? Rather than thinking, oh, brilliant, you're going to give me some really positive feedback that's going to help me do my job. So my first question is to you, is where do you think the biggest disconnect today is between feedback and the skills or behaviors that organizations expect people to demonstrate to give that kind of positive aspect of welcoming feedback in businesses?
Yeah. So thanks, Garrett. I think from my experience and my observations, feedback's very misunderstood. So culturally, if we think about feedback, and words are really impactful, feedback in a great culture is an opportunity to empower and develop. Feedback in a poor culture, which is undernourished and people don't have time to develop the understanding of it, is you get an email saying, on Thursday, I want to have a chat with you about X. And you have that moment of dread. That's when you've got a poor feedback culture. So there's 3 areas that all organizations can think about. Are you an avoider of feedback? So you procrastinate. Do you not have the time to plan the feedback? Are you and your team upskilled in understanding how to be fair and consistent? And those are the 3 things. So you might have a bunch of leaders using a biased and stressed way of communicating, and in their mind, they perceive that as feedback. But if you're stressed and you're biased and you've not had time to plan any type of conversation, that is not feedback. So that's all I will say for now. But those 3 areas: avoidance, time to plan, and upskilling people to understand the essence of the skill of feedback.
Yeah, I think you've mentioned a really interesting point there about procrastination about giving feedback, and I often find that people that procrastinate about giving feedback are the ones that dread giving feedback the most and struggle to have the right skills or ability to communicate that feedback in a timely way, so it then just amplifies the nature of the challenging conversation that they might be needing to have. Stuart, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, and maybe some of how some of the, I suppose, the knowledge and the skills of being able to deliver feedback correlate back to the essence of, or the experience of getting that feedback. What's your view?
So I like Kay's take on that. One thing, we've been doing a lot of work recently in something called just culture development. So just culture development. And the idea of it is to create a high performing culture, which is a name check, which was unintended, right? But a high performing culture where people essentially feel pretty safe. And that's getting feedback, receiving feedback, and calling things out which aren't right. And I think our driver for this in technology, which is where we focus, is to hit lofty heights and ambitions, things that we wouldn't necessarily put in our world. For example, we work with aviation consultants. I don't know if Paul is on this live stream or not, but the idea of bringing aviation levels of brilliance to other industries, and the only way that you can do that, the reason why planes stay in the sky, is because feedback is readily given and accepted. And something which we kind of need to remember is people that are giving feedback aren't teachers. So teachers are professional they should be able to give feedback. They're teachers, they've trained for it, but a manager's not, not necessarily. And so the idea of feedback avoidance, like people not wanting to give it, you almost have to look up here and think, right, it's not about that one-to-one conversation there where this manager has to give feedback here, or it's 360-degree feedback where someone in your team is giving feedback on you. These are all great constructs, but you kind of have to look at culturally, what does it look like for us to all move forward to a common mission or a goal? And I think that understanding everyone's weakness there and the weakness of the feedback giver, I'm not great at receiving feedback, quite honestly. I kind of struggle with it. And part of that is I've had teachers at school which were brutal. I've had bosses which have been brutal, and you do tense up a little bit. And again, I think it just comes around culturally. What's the process for feedback? What's the purpose of it? Is it to do better tomorrow, or is it to kind of get through today? I think that's kind of an important thing, the way I look at this.
I really like that, Stuart. And as you were talking there was a feedback model that that came back to my mind. And I did say please do not swear on this, but I'm going to break that rule. And I'm sure anybody who's watching has probably heard of this analogy, which is the shit sandwich of feedback. The shit sandwich feedback model, where you give positive, the formative bit, and then you layer it with layer it with another bit of positive. Now the bit that I've always found in that, and you said it there, Stuart, in terms of we can come defensive to some of the feedback. If you're layering in positive, formative, positive, the only bit that I typically tend to remember in any of those conversations is just that formative bit in the middle. And the fact that you, as the leaders, maybe sandwiched the crappy bit of feedback in between two positives, I think is endemic of some of the challenges that people have in being comfortable and giving formative feedback. And Kay, you said something when we were planning for this that I just want to kind of touch on, because it's relevant to this point. Is about how we reward progress over total success. And I'm really interested in that kind of concept to say, right, how does that manifest itself in conversations that leaders have with their team?
Mm-hmm. So again, I really like what you said there, Stuart, about that. That's a culture. You're creating a culture, aren't you? And that leads to that conversation there that Gary's relating to. Progress is different for all of us. So you've got a team of 12 managers, let's say, and you might have 2 that are new, 3 that are really experienced, but they've all got blind spots. So the progress is down to, if you have time as a leader and an organization to plan and think about, where are my team here mentally, performance wise, behavior wise, you're going to spot how you can reward their progress. And it might be something as silly as they've managed to do 2 more one-to-ones with somebody, and as a result there's been a promotion. So the progress looks different for everybody, and this is why having feedback as a skill, going back to your point, Stuart, creates safety, because actually it's an expectation. When feedback is done really well and you're not getting feedback, good, bad or ugly, obviously done with finesse, then you're failing, because it should be an expectation of the teams. And a really good organisation. So I've worked on an interim role with Unify this year, and I did some work in Barcelona. And what I noticed in the European team is they're more comfortable with feedback. Sometimes, if you're not used to it, it could have appeared brutal, but it wasn't. It was actually refreshing. So I think it's an expectation, and I think it's a form of safety when it's done right. It creates safety.
Brilliant.
When you reward progress.
I'm just going to attest that we are actually live, because we've got Dan Shercliffe from Stockport joining us.
Hi, Dan.
We've got Gordon Petrie from sunny Sunderland. And we've got Nick Holmes joining us from Capita as well. So welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for confirming that we are actually not talking to ourselves and we're live. Stuart, I'm going to move into, I suppose, more of the operational management and the day-to-day running of organizations. And in most organizations, most, I suppose, high-performing ones, or just more that kind of have structure and order to some of the goals that they're trying to do for the year, they might have like objectives and key results that they're working to. And quite often, I think some of those can be tick boxes. Say, did we do it, and have we hit what we were supposed to achieve? And the feedback that goes along with that can sometimes be either quarterly, biannually, or you find out at the end of the year how somebody's perceiving your performance to be. I want to kind of dive into how we make those OKRs a bit more meaningful. So my question to you, just to start off with, is how effectively do you think organizations connect individual development conversations to the wider business priorities and some of the OKRs that they might be set on a monthly, yearly, annual basis?
I think that's a great question. I think typically not that well on the whole. I think that a business will go through different phases depending upon the size. If they're a startup, I think that feedback loop at the beginning it'll be really close because everything will be super important. There'll be stories being told about how it has to be amazing. Then it will get a little bit busier and it'll become less important. And then you've got like different directions to go from. And I think a good way for like OKRs, especially, in a way kind of tie back to culture, in that if we imagine that an OKR is how good are we going to be tomorrow? How good are we going to be next month? And a KPI would be looking at where are we at today? You can't really lose sight of either of those things. And I am doing, okay, so I have to be careful with who. To kind of like give an example, I've been working with someone over these last 2 months who has been absolutely delightful. The guy's been fabulous. Like, he's been really, really good. And he came to us. He came to us on the back of he would potentially have been released from a company, in fact. And when we looked back at his performance, all of the documentation, he was brilliant. He was doing really, really well according to what was documented. And he had no idea this was coming. And it was the most interesting thing for us. And the feedback that he was being given verbally was not particularly constructive. It wasn't in line with where is the company heading in the next 3 months. But you can't just put, all right, in 3 months, this is where we need to be. It's like, well, okay, what are we doing in the next week, the next 2 weeks? And that seems like overkill, but it isn't. You know, it's not overkill. It's one of these things where we talk about, we have daily stand-ups for our tasks today. We will kind of quickly review what went wrong. Oh, so what are our blockers from yesterday? It's like, well, that level of macro detail about the project is not a problem. Like, yeah, of course that's what we do. But when it comes to the development of the person, oh, it's overkill. Quarterly reviews are enough. 6 monthly or yearly reviews are enough. And it's like, well, why can the project have a daily stand-up to report where we currently are, but yet people can't have it? So I think typically not all that well, and it's a huge opportunity for growth for all kind of companies. And again, a comment that I would make: planes are not staying in the sky because there's a yearly review. You know, they're not staying in the sky because there's a 6 monthly review or anything like that. They're staying in the sky because this is meticulously managed. And again, in technology, where we've got one of the most fruitful, most exciting kind of cultures of startups and new things happening all the time, AI kind of like empowering so many things and creating a lot of noise, it's never been more important that the decisions that we take are informed against, well, what company do we want to be? So I think typically not that well.
And Stuart, the next time I'm on a plane, if I don't ask the pilot when his last feedback session was, remind me, because that kind of scares me, the thought of sitting in that seat now. Kay, just kind of building on that point. And when we talk about OKRs and goal setting, we try and do that, and we try and be as clear as we possibly can. But do you think in some respects we're setting people up to fail in some of the goals and some of the OKRs that we're holding people to account for, and we're not being, I suppose, a little bit more agile in how we're approaching that feedback in a real-time way?
Yeah, I think there's one distinct thing that happens from an operational excellence perspective. You've got the strategy here, and you've got the arms of the strategy. You might have recruitment, training, operations, and they all have this supposed goal. Actually, no, what they have is an overbearing amount of OKR. So you've got your objectives and you've got your key results. One question I'm asking organisations at the moment, I say Gary and I, with our high performing culture opportunity and approach, is what's your measure of success really? When it gets to the end of years, what is it you're measuring the success of? What is it you really want to do? Is it the upskilling of a sales methodology to convert higher? Is it upskilling your leaders to get better at better conversations and giving feedback? So sometimes I question, and I really do question, is training needs analysis at the beginning of a project. When you train him, it sometimes is built on unrealistic foundations that are assumptions. So if we dig deeper and we say, right, we really want to measure 3 metrics, 3 only, and you fine tune them, what you are doing is you've got a great opportunity to achieve 3 key things, and the other things will happen as a result of it. What I see a lot of is you get a skills matrix with 24 competencies on, and no one's going to be at a 5 of a 1 to 5 on all of those. So sometimes expectations are blurred, and I think with OKRs, it's sometimes, or KPIs, it's overwhelming rather than motivating because there's too many of them.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on something really important there, is to say, right, when we're starting a new project, or when we're kind of engaging a new team in a new way of working, the feedback that people will get might be because we've not appropriately defined what their skill set is and what their strengths are. So when we then come to sort of like start the motions of a project, or when they start a new role, we've not been really clear in the expectations right from the get-go of what we expect, but also what their capabilities are around it. So I think we need to be really clear on what the capability framework is that wraps around different initiative, different ways of working, different tools that we're rolling out to organizations. And that in itself, I suppose, drives an opportunity for growth, which is my next question, which I'm going to kind of ask you to kind of lead on, Kay, in terms of thinking about feedback as a growth catalyst. I think there are organizations that are probably still immature in how they approach feedback and what their understandings are of a coaching culture and a feedback culture. If you were looking at organizations holistically, what are some of the signs that feedback in organizations might still be being perceived as judgmental feedback and opinionated feedback, rather than delivering that as something developmental that can aid their growth and help support them in kind of doing a better job for business?
Good question. The number one thing is a really busy diary with no thinking space in and no time to plan. If you've not got those in there, it's impossible to lead, because then what happens is, and I've written down some of what Stuart said so I could go back to it, is what you've got there is you don't have a human-centered feedback mechanism. You have a transactional culture and mechanism. And so what happens is you witness busy diaries, you feel the negativity of feedback because it does feel and it looks rushed. And it's the rushed approach and it's the environment that it happens in. So some of the work that Gary and I have done, Stuart, is, and everyone that's watching, is in high performing culture, we've got a module around coaching for success and radical feedback, which is our own model, very similar to radical candor, but slightly different. And we talk about restorative coaching, restorative feedback. So Gary, I've got some really good feedback for you. Leave your desk, get yourself into like a woody area. We'll put our mobile phones to our ears and we'll go for a walk. I've got some great feedback for you. That feedback then is in a place not about work. It's in a place where you can think about everything but work and just focus on that. The environment is massive. I could go on forever. I know we've got 40 minutes, so I'm not going to.
I think you touch on a really interesting point, though, around how do you deliver feedback constructively if it's more developmental in a remote setting versus when you can kind of sit down and have a look in the whites of your eyes conversation and have a really open and honest conversation. What's your thoughts on that, Stuart? Well, how important do you think environment is in having a really good developmental feedback session versus perhaps not really being primed and ready for that, and it being that more opinionated or subjective feedback session?
So I think that environment is no doubt critical, but you can have a really successful distributed business where a lot of stuff is done online, because when you come back to the basics of it, people are people, and depending upon the nature of whatever the feedback culture is in the business, whether it's in an office surrounded by peers or whether it's kind of like you're working with people on the other side of the world, if it kind of goes back to the OKR thing, if you are all pushing towards whatever is common and it's really clear what we're all pushing towards, then that can make a big difference. I think the judgmental feedback typically comes when it's potentially made under duress, something in the project isn't quite right, because most people aren't evil. Some are, and we've definitely worked with them before, but most people aren't, right? And so it's not so
Yes,
much the people giving or receiving the feedback, it's the pillars which are around them. And I think that if you're in the same room, for some people that could be more kind of intimidating. But one thing that I would say is the example that I gave before about this chap that came to us who was essentially all but out of the company. We gave him another way, another kind of like another chance. When I met him for the first time, I met him online, and it was a bit of a struggle. And I'm not going to lie, the kind of first thought was, okay, I don't know whether we can turn it around or not. Met in person, and it was transformed. Now that isn't always going to be possible, and the idea of a session like this, the idea of feedback is we're probably not going to hit perfection, but what building blocks and foundations can we put in place that, well, at least we're bloody well trying. So environment, it kind of extends beyond physical environment. It's more of the structure in place, whether you're distributed or whether you're all in the same office, I think.
Yeah, and you know, we said it right at the start in terms of that, I suppose, culture of feedback. What tips, Kay, would you give to an organization that maybe needs to reposition or kind of redefine feedback as a growth tool rather than a here's some feedback and you're not going to like it?
So I'd use a scenario. So I'd get a pain point, and that pain point might be that there are no feedback conversations taking place, and as a result, end of years are not fair. Going back to what Stuart said, and I'm talking about this because it's really common at the moment, and I'm helping a business, no names mentioned, deal with this at the moment. So that's because when we have been given feedback throughout the year, we've procrastinated. So the feedback should have been in March, let's say, for one business, that a conversation should have taken place between team leader and manager that's being developed. Right, last Wednesday, Fred, you were doing a team huddle, and I noticed that a few people were disengaged. So you've been honest, you've been candid, and you've given them an opportunity to think about that time, that specific day. Okay, what I'm going to do tomorrow is I want us to have half an hour together, and I want us to think about what went well, but what you think needed to improve. This is not criticism. This is a great opportunity for us to work together and learn how to give each other feedback. And I welcome yours. What you've done is you've given them feedback, you've given them reflection time, and we all like autonomy. We all like to make that decision ourselves. Then the next day, you reiterate over the point. Right. So again, last Wednesday, this happened. What are your thoughts? It's mature. It's not evasive. And somebody's made their own mind up. That creates that feedback culture. But what it does, it creates growth, because that then becomes a behavior and an expectation. Another thing that I want to add is feedback shouldn't always be predictable. Simon Sinek talks about this, and I love Simon Sinek because he makes sense. So if something's too predictable, it's taken for granted. If it's, like Stuart says, we're not always privileged to be in person. So if Stuart wants some feedback from me, Kay, let's get a coffee. I want your thoughts on something. That's a skill. That's growth. Not, I've got some feedback for you. So somebody feels defensive. Because like Stuart, I used to be pretty bad at getting feedback based on past events, not working in good cultures.
You know what? It's interesting because you talk about performance reviews, and we're probably all either doing them now for the year, so we're doing the end of year reviews, or we're planning them to start them in January. And I think a leader said to me once, he says, if you're having difficult end of year conversations with people, it's because you've failed to have the conversations periodically throughout the year to give them timely and developmental feedback and an opportunity for growth. And I always reflect on that, in that all of the difficult conversations that I've ever had are probably because I've procrastinated too much. I've avoided the conversation, and I should have tackled it much earlier on, and given people that kind of honest view and that candor and that candid approach that might not be comfortable at the time, but it helps give that person the opportunity to turn things around, rather than that whole, right, you thought you were operating at a 5 this year out of 5. Well, actually, you think you're a 2. And that's just far too late in the day to be having those conversations.
Can I add something in there, Gary? Sorry.
Absolutely, yeah.
So language, semantics is so important, and I think this is why planning is important more than anything. Is if Stuart said to me, a development area that you have is this K, I'm already defensive. So the semantics and the language that we use are absolutely key. But I also think the mind state of how we perceive things. So I hear this and it really pisses me off. I did swear, sorry. Is dealing with difficult conversations? Absolutely not. No, get rid of that statement. So it might be challenging because of the way that we perceive it. 80% of the time, the things that we think are challenging are not. We're too busy, we're too stressed, we're undernourished in that skill. So the reframe of how we see feedback should be the first thing that we do when we learn what feedback really is.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting point, that, because if we're fortunate enough to be in a leadership role, hopefully we have been trained in that leadership role. But if you speak to people like Martin Teasdale, he talks about that overnight transformation of being a leader. One day you're in with the team and you're in maybe in a contact center environment and you're one of the team. The next you're actually leading a team, but there is an expectation that you've suddenly gravitated to this label of leader. But what we don't actually think about, these two things, quite often we're not good enough at training those people before they've assumed that role to give them the skills to be able to coach and offer feedback. But also, is there some work that we need to do with people within the organization to try and do that reframe, so that people really think about, actually, I want to be asking for feedback rather than reacting to feedback? What are the things that you think organizations need to do to create that hunger from the front line or from our peers to actually be demanding of feedback, so I can develop in my role? Stuart, what's your thoughts about that? And Kay, any builds on it? How do we encourage people to be more demanding of leaders to actually give us more constructive feedback?
I think you need to show them a kind of like a path for it. If you ask for the feedback, okay, you get the feedback that you need. What impact does it have on them? What impact does it have on what they're working on? And it to be really, really clear. And something about leaders, I think we can ask the team members, right, what can we do to encourage them to go and ask for this feedback? And kind of, if we just put to one side for a minute that we might have a leader that's really new, but just generically we have a leader, it's really important that they understand their role. And their role, and I talk about this quite a lot, is as a leader and not a manager. It's to inspire, and it's to provide some kind of leadership to how we're going to get to where we're going to get to. This is the path that I think we should take. What do you think? And take people on the journey. And I think that we can only reasonably encourage people to ask for this feedback and to challenge for it almost, if there's a will to do something with it. So you get the feedback. Okay, what can I do with what I've got? Feedback. I know that I did this well, I didn't do this well, whatever it may be. Where can I now apply it? And it will be seen. And it's not just about the bottom line, it being seen so people can see how fabulous you are, but what are you contributing towards? So I think it starts with the leader themselves in order to get to that point, recognizing that a leader is there, how they make people feel, how do they get them to the destination they should be at.
Brilliant. I've got a question related to that I want to ask you, Kay. But before I do that, I just want to kind of say, Lisa Wallace, just off the back of the conversation we've had there around numbers and kind of having that kind of journey, is talking a little bit there about where's the opportunity to grow beyond the 5 if you don't understand where you are in the journey. And actually, I think we make a really important point around that. You said it earlier, Kay, semantics and numbers, and I want to be this, I want to be that. Sometimes it's not about the number, it's about the skill and the growth that you've got within that. So I think we need to be really careful when we're using gradings and matrices. I know we all have them, but we need to be really careful that people just aren't aspiring to be a 5 because maybe that 5 comes with a bit of a pay rise. Kate, the point that Stuart then made just then around kind of leaders and kind of their opportunity to grow into a role that kind of helps develop people. I think we've talked about this before around kind of being a little bit more vulnerable as a leader, and the concept of positive vulnerability. Where do you think that concept fits in leaders when they're having feedback and coaching conversations? Where do they need to demonstrate a little bit more positive vulnerability with their own teams?
Yeah, well, you know that I'm a big fan of Carl Jung and shadow work. It can be seen as spirituality, but in actual fact, no, it's psychologically, it's a requirement for us all to work through. I always say the first part of your life is learning the things that condition you. The last part of your life, the latter part, when you get to my age, 40 plus, let's say, you're untangling the thinking and the conditioning. And what the reason I mentioned this, and it's a bit deep, shadow work shows you we've got dualities as human beings. We've got great sides and we've got these unconscious thinking things and habits that take place. So positive vulnerability is having the courageous act of showing up as self in all environments. And some people say you can't go to work as your full self. Well, of course, we've all got different facades. We all have. I've got one now in front of the screen. But the positive vulnerability aspect is, if we say to leaders when we're developing and nourishing them, right, this environment, first of all, today is about failing fast and learning at your own speed. And what we mean by that is, I'm going to be showing you some theory. I'm going to be talking about things that you already know, and then you're going to be learning some new things to think about and go away. And what we invite you to do is think about, oh, actually, if I was going to use that in my learning environment, and then I take it away and apply it operationally, what do I think is going to be easy? What do I think is going to be a challenge? What we're doing is we're painting a picture of, we don't expect to be perfect. We expect you to give it a go. That's where it starts. It's got to start within learning and development. It's got to start within the CEO conversations. And the CEO, again, of an organization, Ben from Max Contact, has mentioned quite a few things about feedback. And he spoke about it's the wording and the beliefs that are around it. And when Stuart said earlier on, I've not always been great with feedback, and I haven't. That's because my upbringing was very critical. My dad criticised me from a young age. I talk about this when I do my public speaking or the events because it's relatable and it holds resonance. I mention it, 20 other people go, yeah, my dad did that to me, or my ex-boss did that to me. Let's normalise that actually that's not a criticism of someone else. We're all dysfunctional. And you can see how passionate I am about this. The shadow work of Carl Jung is something that needs to be threaded in all leadership programs to normalise we're not perfect, actually, and linked to feedback.
And Stuart, I think Kay makes some really great points there, and she talked about being human-centered in delivering feedback. How important, in your view, and how do leaders adopt that human-centered approach to feedback so that they can show up in a positively vulnerable way and create psychological safety for the teams that they're working with?
I think the psychological safety for the teams comes from their leaders will make mistakes, right? Leaders will make mistakes, managers will make mistakes, and it's almost like a common ground that, okay, you've got this position, but we're all contributing to whatever it is that we're contributing towards. And I think that much of it will come down to people feeling safe when they ask for feedback, is they know exactly what they're contributing towards, not just the task that they're doing. So I think human-centric feedback is at the core of everything that we would at least try to do, especially now when you've got more and more systems which are going to be using automation and AI and having like really basic things in development. For example, would be, how many commits did you make to your software, to your GitHub repository? As a software engineer, is that a metric of productivity? No, it's not. So the more metrics like that we introduce, the more automated, cold, hard numbers, similar to what kind of like Lisa was mentioning before about what the 5 and what that means. You kind of have to come away from that, and it's all about less, again, kind of about feeling and less about, okay, what was your KPI score this year? What result did you get? And it's like, well, what's that based on? So human centric starts from remembering the leader is leading the company, the project, whatever it may be. They're going to make mistakes. These guys will be making contributions to that in their own streams. Forget the streams. What are we building together?
Yeah. And you know what, it's so true. I've often said in a lot of leadership programs that I run is that the leader in an organization, and I'm going to specifically reference almost like middle tier leadership here, because they have the biggest impact on probably the widest population that they can touch personally, in that if they show up having a bad day, 20 or 30 people recognize that they're having a bad day. So it's interesting that the impact of one, the power of one, and the human sentiment that goes with that. And we've talked about it a lot, Kay, in the past, around how you have a more empathetic approach to delivering feedback and thinking about the perspective of others that are receiving that feedback. How do we encourage more leaders to lean into that kind of emotionally intelligent conversation?
Yeah. I think, do you want to lead with that one, Stuart, or do you want me to?
I think I'd be interested in your approach, Kay, from kind of some of the conversations that you've had around some of the stuff that you've done with your echo coaching model, your radical feedback model, because all that's anchored a lot in emotional intelligent conversations that leaders have to have. And I think it's easy for us to become more transactional in a remote environment. So how do we encourage more leaders to kind of lean into that emotional intelligent conversation and harness the power of that kind of empathy and the power of one?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Gary. So if you picture, you've got a learning zone and then you've got a mentorship zone. So the learning zone is, we teach somebody, let's say, for example, we teach them, we facilitate a conversation around a scenario that could be something that they're dealing with on their day-to-day job as a manager, let's say a manager that's in a middle position. And it's something that everyone's challenged with, and it showed up in a training needs analysis. So we give them a learning environment, we do a scenario, they go over something that's a piece of theory, they have a practice. Then the mentorship zone is immediately, as quickly as possible, you've got this mentor that's going to help you embed that as a skill. So for those two things to be very clear, because Stuart's talked about clarity quite a lot, and it means such a lot to me. Clarity comes from, okay, we've got a learning zone. That means that every fortnight there's going to be a scenario that you're going to work on as manager essentials, and they expect that. Then they expect to be tapping into their mentors that gives them the safety and that frequency of development for it to become a competency. And I think the competency comes from individual light bulb moments of, I get that. That then becomes a behaviour.
Yeah, I like that. What's your? Yeah, no, I think that's. I think it's. I like the way you're bringing out some of that kind of. It's important to break down the skills. So the skills that we're looking for in emotional intelligent conversations might be how to have how to build an empathetic environment that you can kind of start to have a conversation with. But the execution of that is then go and do it, and then observe somebody doing it so that you can give them the feedback, and that person can act as a mentor. And I think that's a really important part that we don't often follow through on in any of kind of the leadership programs that we do, is we kind of baptize you and do a lot of classroom training, but then we don't follow up and inspect what we expect. So I think it's an important part in helping us bridge the skills for people to be able to have really good feedback, and it's giving feedback on the feedback that I think is really important. Stuart, what's your thoughts there on how we kind of help leaders, I suppose, maybe lean more into those emotionally intelligent conversations that might be a little bit more difficult and actually might take up a little bit more time in a time when, as leaders, we're probably all really precious of time?
I think one of the first things is to understand that, especially under time pressures, your you will get a benefit from it. So if you have the conversation, your time will be repaid. So it might take a little bit longer, but ultimately you've got these people in your team. Give them the best platform that we can to help them succeed. It's a kind of spotlight on something. I was in a meeting recently, and the line was said, okay, I like the blame game, but I'm going to go somewhere quieter so I can defend myself. And this was in a live meeting that was just happening, kind of thing. And the you can imagine the context and the background and what prompted that kind of a response. And as you can imagine, that meeting was not successful. We didn't really resolve anything. And the consequences of that meeting I've still felt today. So you need to know know your audience, because I also have to make a point that we're being quite soft. I'm being quite soft about how we should treat people and what perfection looks like, etc. There's the kind of the reality part of it as well, where again, sorry to use the analogy again, but planes don't stay in the sky because we use the analogy of, say, the shit sandwich, for example, right? Every layer of that feedback, it needs to be, planes stay in the sky because people understand with absolute clarity what it is that they need to do, but where they fit. And if they realize and see the importance of where they fit, that emotionally intelligent conversation is much easier to do. And an example of this is about somehow maybe 5 years ago now. A company that I was working with at the time, we did some of our absolute best work because of coronavirus. And it was because when we were going to be shifting from a completely in-person environment to completely online, we really needed to be strict with what it is we were expecting people to do, where that was the team, it was the people we were working with, clients. Way more clarity than we'd ever given the team before, quite frankly. And everyone knew exactly, if they do this and then at this time these guys do this, it will all kind of come together. So I think from an emotional intelligence perspective, recognize that the investment that you make now, you've got these people, spend that time, because otherwise you'll have conversations that go like, I like the blame game, but now I need to defend myself. And it's like, that's not going to be useful for anyone, because that 15-second sentence, 3, 4, 5 weeks later, we're still talking about.
It has a lasting impact, doesn't it? Definitely does.
Okay,
I'm going to come to you here, because I think when we talk about feedback, when we talk about coaching, there's a capability framework, and there's an adoption of that capability that needs to happen. And the way people are learning these days is very different. And I think you've talked recently about some really interesting concepts that are fairly new to me, that I don't think many people will probably be familiar with, but I think they're really interesting principles to kind of help people think about how they train out really good feedback, how they train out really good coaching programs, and it's around meta learning. So if I was to ask you to briefly describe to me and anybody who's watching, what do we define as meta learning, and why is that important when it comes to balancing feedback models, coaching models, all of those different things?
Okay, so I'm a bit obsessed by it, aren't I, Gary? So I do a lot of reading. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I've got this new love of podcasts, and I've slightly fallen in love with Tim Ferriss and his brain, the way it works. It's so smart. It's so lean. And so what he talks about is he speaks about a 20-80 rule. So let's say we want to teach or facilitate people to how to become more emotionally intelligent. And you've got a program where there's 12 learning modules, and really they only need 2 of those modules to be excellent at the job. But the other things that they're learning are quite handy. What he talks about is, if the meta learning is broken down, it means that we learn how to learn in our own style. So I've got a bit of a challenge with the learning, the way that we learn, the learning cycles and the theory that goes with it. I challenge some of it. So if we think about the way that we learn, I know that I learn slightly differently to Gary, but we kind of come together and we've learned something in the same way. If we learn how to learn, then we learn how to deconstruct the learning that means that if we're learning something autonomously and we know how to learn and we know how to deconstruct it, we understand that there might be a learning outcome that could be, by the end of this session, you will understand how to use the ECHO coaching framework. That's one. The number two could be go away and apply that learning with 2 coachees. And then the action comes from, I know how to learn, I understand the theory, I've broken it down, now I'm going to go away and do something about it. The meta learning is about super focusing on a small percentage of whatever it is that you've learned and becoming absolutely amazing at it. So then you're competent. Because what we're doing at the moment is we have 12-month training programs, which are fantastic. But how much of that do we really use? And how much of it are we really competent with? So are we better at becoming better at 1 or 2 things and then fine-tuning the other things? And that's why I love it, because as adults, we learn very differently to children. So we learn in blocks. So I know that, for example, Stuart and yourself are naturally and innately more interested in tech far more than I am. However, because I've been exposed to people like you and Stuart, and I've learned actually it's not as bad as what I thought, because I learn from watching and I'm kinesthetic, but I'm also theoretical. I go, oh, actually, let's have a look at that now. Okay, so that's what I need to learn. I've learned it in this way from watching a video, having a go, and then I've applied it. Yeah. It's about super focusing.
And I suppose that comes with the part that we see, and you touched on it earlier, is to say we teach a lot of skills, but then those skills aren't then applied and executed effectively because we're just being too broad with the skills that we're training out and not having that hyper-focused approach on really nailing that first or second learning outcome.
They don't become a competency because we're not evaluating it properly, because we don't have mentors and we don't have coaches that are skilled enough to say, well done for that, brilliant, try this.
Yeah. And I'm really interested. So I think the point that you've made is awesome there, Kate, because Kay even. So I've been speaking to a Kate and a K all day, and it's just entirely confusing. The point that you're making there is really interesting, because I think we zone in on competence, and some of that competence is underpinned by the metrics and how we evaluate it, but it's also underpinned by the data that feeds it. And I think we can become obsessed a little bit with data sometimes, and the collation of that data. And Stuart, I'm going to come to you with this question that kind of helps us, I suppose, understand how we use data to understand capability better. And I think when we join up what Kay was talking about there, and then think about the data that underpins it, organizations have endless amounts of data. They've got QA scores, they've got coaching logs, they've got dashboards and surveys. What do you think genuinely needs to be done with data to help leaders understand capability better, to give better feedback, and to give better coaching conversations?
So I think a big part of it comes down to, where does that data come from? And because you're right, there's lots and lots of data, surveys and things. It's like, okay, it's something which is done, but what do we really get from it? I think going back, funnily enough, to almost like the meta learning kind of concept of it. Meta learning ultimately helps you focus on what really matters. That would be what really matters to you, your role, etc. And you can cut through a lot of noise. And again, it comes back to, where do we all fit in and where do we all kind of slot together from a data perspective. In a modern environment, especially, the idea, we go through different cycles. So for example, 360 feedback is quite popular at the moment. So you'll be here and someone working for you will report, someone working above you, someone working side by side. And it sounds amazing. It's kind of like, okay, cool, 360, everyone's going to pitch in. It's like, yeah, but in reality, what's done with it? Like, what do we actually do with any of these things that we've learned? And
spend
so
half your time chasing for the 360 data.
Yeah,
I feel seen, but yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's,
I knew you would.
Without a doubt, in fact, without a doubt. And I think there's a few more organic things which are around these days. So like ongoing kudos style systems. So kind of like, if someone does something cool, throw a star at them. explain what that's
Yeah.
for, and kind of, and that is quite organic, because one of the good things about it, and it can be gamed, this is kind of like the problem with data, right? But if you look for consistency of someone is doing work, they're doing whatever they're doing, and a lot of people from around the business are throwing a spotlight their way for saying, thank you very much for the way that you helped me. And so having some kind of system which really tracks what that organic feedback is, I think is probably one of the most useful ways that we can evaluate capability beyond the rigid metrics that we already have. And so again, with the meta learning is a really good example of potentially that can be the future for so many of us, because in the changes which AI could potentially make to so many different kinds of roles, we may become more architects of what we're working on rather than doing as much. And so that applies as well to this, frankly, the idea that, yeah, we have data, but much of it should probably be not
And
disregarded.
I'm really interested, Stuart, in your thoughts around how we can supply people with the right and appropriate data for them to be able to self-manage, self-coach, and give themselves feedback. And there's a chap called Danny Wareham who talks about leaderless teams, and I think this plays into that point as to where how do people become their own kind of feedback mechanism, and how do we give them the right data and the right tools to be able to access that, to do their own self-improvement. What's your thoughts, Stuart? He's just paused in the most reflective way. Kay, I'll fire that same question to you just while we get Stuart's connection back. How do we give teams the right data to be able to self-manage, self-feedback, and self-coach?
Yeah, I think apprenticeships are fantastic at this. So I'm speaking to an organisation that I'm going to be helping in 2026. So skill scans, for example. So a skill scan is a great opportunity for individuals to complete a questionnaire as honest as they possibly can be in a safe environment. And I've seen it work. It really does work about their competencies. So they answer questions around specific skills and behaviours that are applied to their role only. And it's only a short number of questions to determine out of 60 people, what are the strengths, but what are the gaps? I think simplifying it is a starting place. Let's start off with a skill scan to find out what it is that we really need to fine tune. Going back to Stuart's point, then you can celebrate in a more organic way and a more unpredictable way of measuring success. That's my short version, because I know Stuart has more to say.
Stuart, you froze at a certain point, so I don't know how much you heard of my question, but it's how do we use data to allow people to self-feedback, self-critique, and do more self-improvement?
It's one, I guess, having some exposure to feedback, which we normally wouldn't get. So from like a software sense, all too often, if we build something, for example, we build a website, we build some kind of platform, once it's shipped, engineers, project managers, anything, in fact, will often be moved on to the next thing. And fine, we have to stay productive, but staying close to the work that we've done and ongoing impact that work is making to the client that it's shipped for, or something along those lines, really helps you learn what I did there for that potentially 3 months, 6 months, 3 years in the case of some projects, right? What was the change for the client that I worked for? What did the product that I contributed to, what did it change? What did it do for the business? And what did it do for the customer that bought it? And so that's kind of like fairly hard edged, to be honest. But I think that is, if we're talking about one really meaningful metric, it's, well, I've just spent this much time working on something. What did it do? And then people can tell you all around, oh yeah, but you were a bit mean in that meeting, or you were a bit quiet that week. It's like, okay. And that is something which needs to be tackled. But that goes back to the point of the daily stand-up idea, not necessarily of feedback, but of a person, not just of a project. And you can catch that then. But the one joined up metric what did I do and what impact did it make?
You know, I think that's quite a profound statement for us to reach the top of the hour. Is what contribution did I make, and how do I impact others? I think is a really useful reflection tool for us to think about in all of the things that we do. So we are literally bang on the hour. It's just turned 1 o'clock, so we've timed that to perfection. All that's left for me to say is thank you very much for Kay and Stuart for giving some really useful practical tools, insights and value in that session. It is approaching Christmas, so I have to say Merry Christmas to everybody and Happy New Year. I'm going to ask Kay and Stuart just to stop on, but for everybody else who watched, thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you got some value from that session. Please rewatch the playback if you didn't get a chance, and if you enjoyed what you had to or enjoy what you heard, drop us a comment and give us some feedback on the in the comments. We wouldn't be right if we didn't ask for feedback. So thank you very much for tuning in, everybody. Take care and have a great Christmas.
Thank you.